The whole room laughed. Every single one of them. There were maybe 60 people packed into the Colebrook Municipal Hall that Saturday morning. Farmers, contractors, a few estate lawyers in shirts that cost more than most people's monthly grocery bill. And every one of them turned to look at the young man in the back row when the auctioneer called out his bid. $60. Then $75. Then, when old Pete Gruber from the hardware store shook his head and dropped out, the young man raised his hand one final time, $90. The laughter started somewhere near the front and rolled back through the room like a wave. Not cruel laughter, most of them would say later. Just the kind that comes naturally when something strikes you as genuinely absurd. A burned-out safe from the wreckage of the Lakemont Inn. A safe that had sat untouched in a county storage yard for 14 years, that every appraiser in Colebrook County had written off as structurally compromised and almost certainly empty. Going to a 20-year-old kid who looked like he'd driven there in a truck with a busted taillight. Sold, said the auctioneer without much ceremony. The young man's name was Joel Achebe. He was 20 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that some people mistake for simple. He worked mornings at a timber yard outside of town and spent his afternoons in the small garage behind his mother's house, taking things apart and putting them back together. Locks, mostly. Clocks sometimes. Once a vintage cash register that a woman from the Historical Society had written off as scrap. He'd returned it to her in working condition 3 weeks later and refused to accept more than the cost of parts. He came by it honestly. His father, Emmanuel Achebe, had been a locksmith. One of the best in the county, people said, though they said it mostly in past tense now, and with the particular softness people use when someone has been gone long enough that the grief has turned into something quieter. Emmanuel had died in the fire that destroyed the Lakemont Inn 14 years ago. The official report said it was an electrical fault. A junction box in the basement overloaded and unserviced. Jolt had been 6 years old. He remembered the smell of his father's work jacket. He remembered the sound of tumblers clicking when Emmanuel let him sit on the workbench and watch. He remembered, with the specific precision of a child who loses something before he fully understands what loss means. The morning 2 officers came to the door, and his mother made a sound he had never heard her make before and has never heard anyone make since. What he did not remember, because he had not been told, was that his father had gone back into the Lakemont Inn that night for a reason. The safe came apart in his mind before it came apart in his hands. Joel hauled it into the garage on a borrowed dolly, settled it on the concrete floor under the overhead light, and sat in front of it for a long time without touching it. The exterior was badly heat damaged. The dial housing was warped, the handle seized, the surface patched with the dull gray of oxidized metal where the lacquer had burned away. But the body itself was solid. Cast iron, mid-century, the kind built to survive exactly what it had survived. The model was a Hargreaves Series IV, discontinued in 1987. Joel had looked it up the night before, printed the specs off a library computer, and noted with quiet satisfaction that the Series IV had a secondary locking mechanism behind the main dial, a feature most people didn't know about, and one that most locksmiths wouldn't bother with. His father had told him about it once. He couldn't have been more than 5. Emmanuel had shown him a photo in an old trade catalog. See this, Joe? You take away the obvious lock and people think they've got everything. But there's always another door if you know where to look. Joel put on his headlamp and got to work. The auctioneer's name was Cliff Bouchard. He'd been running estate and municipal sales in Colebrook County for 22 years, and he prided himself on knowing the value of what passed through his hands. After the Lakemont safe sold, he mentioned it to his wife over dinner that evening, mostly as a small story about the unpredictability of people. Young Achebe kid, he said, Emmanuel's boy, paid $90 for that burned-up safe from the hotel. The whole room laughed. His wife didn't say anything for a moment. Did he say why he wanted it? Cliff shrugged. Didn't ask. Figured it was sentiment. Or foolishness. Maybe both. What Cliff Bouchard didn't know, what almost nobody in Colebrook knew, because the people who did know had spent 14 years making sure of it, was that the Lakemont Inn had not burned down because of a faulty junction box. It had burned down because of what was in that safe. The Lakemont Inn had been owned, at the time of the fire, by a man named Gerald Price. Gerald Price was 71 years old now and lived in a large house on the west side of the county with a view of the lake he had always claimed to love. He had rebuilt after the fire, not the inn but his finances, and then his reputation, and then his standing in the community. He served on the board of 2 local charities. His name was on a plaque at the arena. People shook his hand at functions and meant it. Gerald Price had not thought about the safe in a long time. He had not thought about it because there was no reason to think about it. The county had taken it in the cleanup, some low-level clerk had logged it as scrap salvage, and it had sat rusting in a yard for 14 years. No one had opened it. No one had tried. Gerald Price had assumed, with the comfortable certainty of a man accustomed to things going his way, that no one ever would. He was at his daughter's house for Sunday brunch when he heard that the Achebe boy had bought it. He set his coffee cup down very carefully. Joel worked on the safe for 2 days. The main dial mechanism was damaged but salvageable. He cleaned the housing with solvent, replaced 2 corroded pins he sourced from an old safe he kept in the corner of the garage for parts, and spent the better part of a Tuesday evening feeling for the contact points with the same patient attention his father had taught him to use. Not pressure, not force, listening. His mother, Achebe, brought him food he mostly forgot to eat. She watched him from the doorway a few times without saying anything. She had not asked him why he'd bought it. She was a woman who understood, in the particular way of people who have survived real grief, that some things need to work themselves out on their own schedule. On the second night, just past midnight, Joel found the secondary mechanism. It was behind a false back panel, accessible only once the main lock released, a detail that would have meant nothing to anyone who didn't know to look for it. He eased the panel open with a flathead screwdriver, located the secondary tumblers, and spent another 40 minutes working through them one by one in the silence of the garage. The only sounds the occasional click of metal, and once, a car passing slowly on the road outside. The safe opened at 1:17 in the morning. Inside, there was a metal document box, sealed, a small ledger, water-stained but largely intact, a USB drive in a Ziploc bag. Whoever had put it there had thought ahead, and a handwritten note on Lakemont Inn letterhead dated 3 days before the fire. The note was addressed to Gerald Price. Joel sat on the concrete floor and read everything twice. Then he sat for a long time without reading anything. His father's name appeared in the ledger 4 times. Not as a victim, not as a casualty, as a witness. Emmanuel Achebe had serviced the safe at the Lakemont Inn 6 months before the fire, and during that visit he had seen something he wasn't meant to see. Financial records, Gerald Price's handwriting, numbers that did not match the numbers the county had been given for a land development deal that had made Price a very wealthy man, and several other people significantly poorer. Emmanuel had copied what he could. He had put it in the safe for reasons the note only partially explained. Something about waiting until he had spoken to a lawyer, about not wanting to move until he was certain. He had never gotten to be certain. The note from Price, addressed to someone whose name was redacted, or perhaps had always been a title rather than a name, said, in plain and terrible language, that the contents of the safe needed to not exist, that arrangements had been made, that the matter would be resolved before the week was out. The fire had been set 3 days later. The official investigation had found no evidence of arson. Joel did not sleep that night. He called his mother into the garage at 6 in the morning and showed her what he had found. Achebe read the note slowly, then the relevant pages of the ledger, and when she looked up her eyes were dry in the way of someone who has already spent all the tears available for a particular grief and is now operating on something steadier and colder. "We need a lawyer," she said. "I know," said Joel. "Not someone local." "I know," he said again. They found one through a legal aid contact in the city, a woman named Sandra Osei, who specialized in wrongful death claims and had, as she put it when she met them, a specific interest in cases involving fires and people who were supposed to stay quiet. Sandra reviewed the documents, had the USB drive examined by a forensic analyst she worked with, and began the process of building a case that would take 8 months to fully assemble. During those 8 months, Gerald Price attended 2 charity galas, gave a speech at the arena naming ceremony, and was photographed shaking hands with the regional mayor. Joel went to work. He fixed locks. He came home. He drove his mother to her appointments. He did not talk about what was in the safe, not to his friends, not to anyone. Sandra had been explicit on this point, and he trusted her judgment. There was one moment in those 8 months that almost broke his composure. He was at the timber yard, late shift, and one of the older workers, a man named Al Dutton, who had lived in Colebrook his whole life, stopped him by the loading dock and said, out of nowhere, that he remembered Emmanuel. Said he was a good man. Said it was a damn shame what happened to him, and a worse shame the investigation went the way it did, because he'd always felt there was something off about it, but nobody had wanted to hear it at the time. Joel looked at Al Dutton for a long moment and said, I remember him too. He didn't say anything else, but he carried that conversation with him for weeks. The small and specific comfort of knowing his father had not been invisible to everyone. The case broke publicly on a Thursday morning in October. Sandra Ossie had, over 8 months, reconstructed the land deal in full. The financial fraud was substantial. Price had falsified documentation related to a county development contract, redirecting funds through a numbered company, and the original records Emmanuel had copied were not only authentic but corroborated by 2 additional sources Sandra had found independently. The arson connection was harder to prove directly, but Sandra was not trying to prove it in isolation. She was building a picture, and the picture, once assembled, was not a complicated one. The RCMP opened a formal investigation. The county attorney's office issued a statement. Gerald Price's lawyer told reporters outside his client's house that the allegations were without merit. Gerald Price himself said nothing. He stood in his doorway looking out at the lake that he had always claimed to love, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. The plaque at the arena stayed up for another 3 weeks before the board quietly had it removed. Joel was at the timber yard when Sandra called to tell him the investigation was official. He stepped outside into the cold morning air and stood by the fence line for a few minutes, not calling anyone, not texting, just standing there with his breath fogging in front of him and the sound of the yard machinery running steady behind him. He thought about his father, not the way he usually thought about him, the small fragments, the work jacket, the clicking tumblers, but fully, as a whole person. Emmanuel Achebe, who had seen something wrong and written it down and put it somewhere he thought was safe, because he believed that truth had weight and that weight mattered, who had been 34 years old, who had a wife and a 6-year-old son who used to sit on the workbench and watch him work. The case would take longer. There would be hearings and delays and the particular grinding slowness of institutions being held to account. Gerald Price would hire 3 more lawyers. There would be days when it felt like nothing was moving, and other days when it moved faster than expected. The full outcome was still months away, but the safe was open. The documents existed. The silence that had lasted 14 years was over. Joel went back inside and finished his shift. That evening he went home and sat in the garage for a while. The safe was still there, in the corner, door open, empty now. He had given everything to Sandra, who had given it to the appropriate people, who were doing what needed to be done with it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up a lock from the workbench, a standard deadbolt, nothing complicated, a job someone had dropped off earlier in the week, and got to work. Some people will tell you that justice is a long road, and they're not wrong. Some will tell you that the truth always finds a way out eventually, and maybe that's true too, though it usually needs someone willing to go looking for it. What nobody tells you, what gets left out of every clean version of every story like this one, is how much of it comes down to a single moment of someone refusing to accept that a thing is worthless just because everyone else has decided it is. $90. A room full of laughter. A young man who knew how to listen to the sound a lock makes when it's about to give way. His father taught him that.